Well, we are not quite at 200, but the rate of joining has slowed down a little bit. So let's go ahead and get started. Well, welcome everyone. I'm Jody Ellison Bunnell at Montana State University, which is in a valley. That's the confluence and gathering place for many Indigenous peoples, past and present. I am co-chair of the Rights Statement Working Group of DPLA, and we are really thrilled to have our colleagues from local contexts to present to you about some of the options for working with Indigenous materials that local context has been so central in developing over the last 10 years. I've followed their work really avidly. This is a really important topic for the Rights Statement Working Group. While the material that local context is going to share today, they're not rights statements, they are different. This is Indigenous intellectual property. But there's some really important developments. This is an area of knowledge we all need to have. So we're just delighted to have this partnership going, and happy to have you all joining us. Ooh, now we're at 200 attendees. So I would like to hand off to Corey Rowe, Emily, I forgot to ask how to pronounce your name. I'm sorry. I'll just say Emily, and Stephanie Running Hawk Johnson from Local Contexts. Take it away, colleagues.
Thank you, Jody. We really appreciate it. Emily's getting us going here. All right, here we go. So, Ampatu Washte, good day, everyone. I first just want to say thank you so much for inviting us to this. We're really excited to be here, and we hope that this is helpful and useful, and that we can answer questions for you and kind of give you a tool to use as you think about working with Indigenous communities. So I will introduce myself first, and then I'm going to pass it along over to Corey and Emily to introduce themselves as well. So as you can see on my screen, my name is Stephanie Running Hawk Johnson. I am a citizen of the Oglala Lakota Nation, and I am the founding executive director for Local Context. Super excited to be here in this capacity. I am coming to you today from the homelands of the Palouse Band of the Nimipu people, which we also call Pullman, Washington. So that's a little tiny bit about who I am, and I'm going to pass it over to Corey and let Corey introduce herself as well.
Awesome. Thanks, Stephanie. So my name is Corey Rowe. I am the Director of Outreach and Strategy with Local Contexts. I'm a settler. I'm based on Wappinger and Paugussett homelands in what's today known as Connecticut. Really excited to be with you all today. My background is in museums, and just excited to be sharing this space. So I'll pass it over to you, Emily, to introduce yourself as well.
Great, thank you. Chukma, good morning, everyone. My name is Emily Santanam. I use she, her pronouns, and I am the outreach coordinator for the Americas here with Local Contexts. I've been in this role for 6 months and change, and I am a citizen of the Chickasaw Nation out of Oklahoma here in what's known as the United States. But I am living and working on the lands of the Red Willow people in Taos, New Mexico. So also really excited to dive into some of the materials we're offering. At this point, we would like to start out with our organizational land acknowledgement. So as an organization that transcends geographic and national boundaries, us at Local Context, we really acknowledge that all of the lands and waters that we occupy are Indigenous homelands. We recognize the ongoing significance of these lands and waters for Indigenous peoples in the past, present, and into the future. Our work is focused on addressing the ongoing legacy of settler colonialism and really in supporting a more equitable future. So we try to do a land acknowledgement to disrupt settler colonialism and also to help recognize whose lands we're on, as well as our responsibilities as guests here.
So before we dive in, we just wanted to also give an overview of what we're planning for today. So we're going to start with a bit of background about local context, what prompted it, where we're at. We're going to start with the notices, which are tools for institutions and researchers before going into the labels. That's the traditional knowledge and the biocultural labels. Those are tools for Indigenous communities. We'll end with some suggestions for getting started and then take your questions. But I'll pass it off to Stephanie to start us off.
Great. Thank you, Corey. So we want to start with some of the ideas that prompted the creation of local contexts and with the challenges that Indigenous people see in data and information systems. So as you all already know, Indigenous data and collections are held in libraries, museums, archives, and other institutions around the world. Because of the colonial legacy of how those materials were collected, significant information is often missing. Information like community names were often excluded, not considered important, or just plain wrong. And this misinformation and misattribution continues to affect communities' ability to find their information and reassert control over this information. Because of the way the intellectual property operates, communities are largely not the legal rights holders of their own information, which then leads to a lack of control and governance. This is an issue of sovereignty and is really concerning, as some Indigenous knowledge and collections are not open or meant to be accessed by just anyone. Add to this that there are more researchers working with Indigenous peoples and data than ever before, and much of an extractive or reductive research paradigm often remains in place. And in this era of big and open data, these mistakes and omissions which exist in the metadata reproduce marginalization and amplify the erasure of difference, and are also replicated into the far-reaching digital forms of this material. So local context started in 2010 as an intervention to bring Indigenous cultural authority and data sovereignty back into cultural heritage spaces. The traditional knowledge labels, which we'll tell you all about, were created through multiple iterations and in partnership with Indigenous communities around the world as a tool for that intervention. The labels were followed by notices, which are for institutions and researchers, and then most recently the biocultural labels and notices for biocultural collections and data. We really started out based out of universities in both the United States and Aotearoa, New Zealand. But in 2022, we became an independent nonprofit organization, and we are registered in Navajo Nation. So as part of that transition to a nonprofit, we established an Indigenous-led council, and I was brought on as the founding executive director with the goal of leading the team through this really exciting next phase that local context is going through.
So these are the digital labeling tools that we offer, which are the labels and the notices. Both the labels and the notices are markers of Indigenous rights, of Indigenous interests, and cultural authority. They can be used in a variety of contexts. We, for instance, have seen them used digitally in collections catalogs, archival records, apps, websites, course syllabus, and other places. We've also seen them used outside of the digital. After we introduce the notices and labels, we're going to share a few examples of their use, but there's many more available on our website if you're interested. We're going to start with the tools for institutions and researchers, which are the notices on the right, and then we'll move into the labels, which are for use by Indigenous communities. So to start with the notices, here at Local Context, we believe that institutions and researchers have a responsibility to disclose Indigenous collections and data and to recognize Indigenous rights and interests. So to help with that, we created the notices. The notices were really created to foster pathways for partnership, collaboration, and support of Indigenous cultural authority. And I'll pass it over to Stephanie to share more about the notices in depth.
Thanks, Corey. So yeah, local context origin is with the traditional knowledge labels, but the notices were developed when we came to find that institutions and researchers are on their own journeys in this work and can really do something to help make visible Indigenous data and collections. And we can do this so that communities can find their knowledge, their belongings, their relatives, their ancestors, and really be part of the decision-making process about their access and use. So the notices can help to disperse some of the labor involved in this work from communities back onto institutions and researchers who often have greater familiarity with their data and their materials. For the labels, we really describe, or the notices, we really describe them in 3 categories, which each function to communicate different Indigenous interests. The first one there is our engagement notice. We call it open to collaborate. And this notice is for an institution or a researcher to commit to ethical reciprocal engagement with Indigenous communities. And oftentimes this is where we see institutions and researchers start with notices. Next are the disclosure notices, and these are for identifying and sharing where there are Indigenous collections. This is working toward that challenge of supporting communities to find and access their collections and their knowledge. And we have 3 disclosure notices: attribution incomplete, biocultural, and traditional knowledge. The third category, which we call collections care notices, were developed within the past year in collaboration with the Smithsonian National Museum of the American Indian. And these are created for collections that are in physical storage and that are stewarded outside of communities. The goal here is to make clear when specialized cultural care is needed. Now, unlike our other notices, these ones were designed to be printed to physically label collection spaces and are used only after consultation with communities. Unfortunately, we don't have examples of this because it really is an internal facing tool, and we largely don't expect the collections that these notices are applied to be public facing.
So before we look at a few instances of notices that are currently in use, we'll first start by going over the 3 parts of the notice, which you can see outlined here. One important note is that notices are not customized and do not change, which we'll talk about later on. It's different from the labels, which can be customized. So first, on the left-hand side here, we have the icon. And as notices are really used around the world, standardizing the icon design is helpful just for recognition purposes. You'll see the title up here, which in this case is the Traditional Knowledge Notice. And again, that one will stay the same. And beneath that, we do have a description, and the text has been standardized as a simplified marker of Indigenous collections. So one important thing to note is that titles and texts are currently available to be translated into Te Reo Maori, Spanish, and French on our hub website. As you can see just below description, may include supplementary statement or information. And that's really because we encourage institutions and researchers to add supplementary statements and to give additional information alongside the notice, which will help give context to why they're engaging within this work, and also might provide next steps should a community be interested in engagement. So with that, we'll now walk through a few examples of notices in use in real-world applications.
Awesome. So we're going to start with a broad application of the notices to a more specific single item level to show the different contexts and the different scales that notices can be applied. We're going to highlight a couple examples that we think are relevant for you all. Again, there are more on our website if you are interested. Here is an open to collaborate notice. This is being used at Washington State University across their manuscripts, archives, and special collections. And they've added this to the footer of their website, which you can see from these 2 screenshots. So they're using the open to collaborate notice to really reinforce their commitment to ethical engagement with Indigenous peoples. You can see here the notice is being used alongside their statement about bias and harmful content, which we've seen other institutions do as well. This is a really great use of the notice and showing that the notices are just one tool that must be part of larger multi-pronged efforts. This next use of the notices is from the University of Queensland. This is in their institutional repository for scholarly research. And you can see here they're using the attribution incomplete and the open to collaborate notice on an about page about this repository. They're using this, they know some of their research from the past contains incorrect or inaccurate information, and they're really committed to working with communities to correct this. pass it over to you, Emily, to do a couple more.
Fantastic, thank you. So here we're looking at the University of Alberta Library Archives catalog, which you can see includes an open to collaborate notice in that top left box. When you actually click into the notice, you'll be directed to a page that describes local contexts and the University of Alberta's commitment to collaborating, partnering, and engaging with Indigenous people. On that same page, they also disclose that their library and archives hold an estimated 311 accessions with Indigenous content, interests, and knowledge, and that they're working to add notices to these records. So this example is also from the University of Alberta Archives, but it shows us moving from collections-wide application to the application of a notice on a single item record. So here is an example of one of the 45 accessions that the University of Alberta added notices to in 2023. And this is an example of a notice that is included in the credits note on a single archives record.
So staying here on the application of the notices at a single item level, we're looking at a record that's in fortepon.us. Fortepon is an open source archival platform. It's focused on an alternative public history based on photographs of everyday life. It's a digital first archive, and it currently has over 22,000 images. So within those 22,000 images, a handful, about 20, have notices that have been applied to them. So they've added the traditional knowledge and or the attribution and complete notices on a selection of their records. And these are for photographs that are about or depict Indigenous people. So they're using these notices to reflect the cultural rights and responsibilities in this material, as well as the possible incomplete information about the photographs.
So our final example of notices here is from the Abbey Museum in Maine. And the museum integrated an open to collaborate notice as well as an attribution incomplete notice on individual catalog records in their online database. And they used PastPerfect as their CMS. So you can see that they've actually added a separate field in their records to include a local contexts field, which then includes the notices that they've applied to those particular records. And I do want to note that the Abbey has added notices to almost every record in their digital database, which is incredible work. And the fact that they were already working with local nations before incorporating local contexts into their collections catalog. Still, they chose to add these notices as an extra measure of increasing visibility around their desire to collaborate, and also around their knowledge that attribution is incomplete for many records in their collections.
So with that, we're going to move on to the labels. So again, the notices, what we've looked at so far, those are tools for institutions and researchers. The labels are for use by Indigenous communities. But through collaboration, labels can be applied by communities onto institution and researcher collections or data. So we're going to talk about that a little bit as well. But the labels are supporting Indigenous communities to reinsert and reassert their cultural authority and sovereignty into spaces. So communities can add these labels to clearly state the provenance, protocols, and permissions of materials. They're a way to keep Indigenous rights and interests with collections and data as they move through different environments, particularly digital environments. So I'll pass it over to Stephanie to tell us a little bit more about labels.
Thank you. So these are the icons for the traditional knowledge or TK labels, and on the right, the biocultural or BC labels. So the goal of the labels is to support that basic acknowledgement and attribution to initiate disruption of the settler systems. They also move towards supporting Indigenous authorship and access, and further beyond that to Indigenous authority and autonomy, as well as institutional accountability. The traditional knowledge labels are for use on cultural heritage, and the TK labels identify cultural material that has community-specific conditions regarding access and use. The biocultural labels were developed starting in 2019 to support community expectations for biocultural collections and data. The BC labels are to support Indigenous peoples' right to decide how biological collections, data, and genetic data that come from their land, waters, and territories are used. The labels can be used by communities to express local and specific conditions for sharing and engaging in future research and relationships in ways that are consistent with existing community rules, governance, and protocols for using, sharing, and circulating knowledge and data. The labels help anyone who accesses the material to understand its significance to the communities from where it derives, and it continues to have meaning with them. So the labels promote new standards of respect by embedding Indigenous rules and protocols within digital systems. Both the BC and TK labels have been developed over the past decade out of international community partnership and multiple iteration. Communities have shared their needs in safeguarding their cultural and intellectual belongings, and so particular labels have been created to support those needs. The label's meanings are related to these three categories of provenance, which is where something comes from, protocols, which is how it should be accessed, and permissions, which is how it should be used into the future. So we're going to look at some examples of the labels in use, but keep in mind that they were designed to be flexible. A label could be used on a community's website or collections database, or more specifically on a single item of cultural heritage or a single item in a data set. So you're going to notice that there are more labels than there are notices, and this is because the labels are more specific. The labels are being used by communities on their own belongings and their own information. The notices, meanwhile, are being applied by institutions and researchers who are stewarding those belongings and information and are being used to clearly identify that Indigenous rights and responsibilities are present, but not what those rights and responsibilities are. That remains the right of the community and is done through the labeling process.
So now we're going to take a look at what these labels actually look like, and we'll dive into one from each category. So unfortunately, we don't quite have time to walk through each of the labels that we offer, but if you are interested, we encourage you to read through them on our website. So first, at the top here, we have an example of a provenance label, and this is our TK Multiple Communities label. So a community might use this label if there are multiple communities who have responsibilities of custodianship or ownership or stewardship over a specific material. Beneath that, we have an example of our protocol label, and this one is our TK seasonal label, which is one of our favorites. This label is all about connecting knowledge and land. So a community could use this label if there are seasonal associations with particular material. So for instance, if certain songs or stories are only meant to be told at a particular time of year. Finally, we have an example of one of our permission labels. So here is our TK non-commercial label, and a community might want to use this label if they would like the material in question to only be used for non-commercial purposes. We actually do also have a BC version of our non-commercial label, and then we also offer TK and BC open to commercialization labels. So both options are possible for a community, depending on whether or not they are interested in potential commercialization or not. So here we have a slide about label customization by Indigenous communities, and every community can create their own set of labels. Each of the labels comes with template text, which you can see in the description, but to further support community sovereignty, communities have the option to customize their label. So unlike the notices which we talked about earlier, labels can be customized by Indigenous communities. So here we're looking at the TK attribution label, which is all about naming and putting proper attribution back into records. So as we did before, we'll review the three main parts of the label. The icon on the left, much like the notices, does not change and is not editable. Whereas the title, which here is the TK attribution, this included in the slide is the standard title name. But we often see communities translating the title into their own language. So the title is able to be customized. Beneath that, we have our description, and here is our template text, which is included. Communities can opt to use this text as it is. They can insert their name where appropriate. And then they can also write their own version of this description. So the community really has the right and the power to decide exactly what to include in a label's description. And this is really an expression of sovereignty that adds specificity and local conditions and meanings around the idea of the label. So now we'll go a little bit deeper into customization by looking at a community's customized version of this TK attribution label.
So we wanted to start with labels that are being used by the Skalitz Band of the Stolo First Nation located in what's today known as British Columbia. This is a screenshot of the homepage of their website. And if you look closely in the top right corner, you can see that the label icons. Clicking on any of those labels on the live site will show you the full label text in English or in French. But we did take a composite here just for the purposes of comparison. So on the left is the Skalitz version of the TK attribution label, and on the right is the label's template text. So as you can see, the Skalitz have titled a label in their language, Hulkamelam. The label text also explains what the label means to them, which is about telling their story in their own words. So by using this label across their website, the Skalitz are labeling the information and stories shared here as their true knowledge and history. They're asking viewers to use this in a respectful way and to also attribute the Skalitz. Next, we'll move on to one of our favorite examples. You might be familiar with it. It's talked about in one of our short films available on our website. We always recommend watching that film to hear about the impact of this work in the words of the Passamaquoddy people. But this is an instance of the labels being assigned for use in an institution that holds a tribe's materials. So in 1890, recordings of the Passamaquoddy tribe's songs and stories were made on Passamaquoddy homelands in what is today known as Maine. These recordings ended up away from the community, first in Harvard's Peabody Museum, and then donated to the Library of Congress. The tribe first heard these recordings in the 1980s, but they could not be understood at that time because the recordings were made on wax cylinders. But with the improvement of technology in the 2010s, the tribe was able to really hear the recordings for the first time. So this screenshot is from the Library of Congress catalog for one of the recordings. And this is after a multi-year collaboration, which involved the tribe's elders listening to the recordings and actually determining what the songs and stories were on those recordings. This information, along with Passamaquoddy words, names, and cultural context, was added with permission to the Library of Congress record, much more than can be pictured in a single screenshot. The tribe really felt comfortable doing this because they were able to apply their TK labels, which you can see on the right side. The three labels that they've applied to all of these recordings are TK attribution, TK outreach, and TK non-commercial. By using these, the tribe is asking for the Passamaquoddy tribe or individuals to be attributed wherever the recording is referenced, for them to be used for educational purposes, and to be used non-commercially. So the labels were also added to the rights advisory field in the record, which we're looking at here. In that field was also Harvard's copyright claim. The library, though, did decide to add the labels first in this record, followed by Harvard. Since the labels have been added, Harvard actually did request that their claim was removed from the record. So the Passamaquoddy are now currently the only party recognized in that rights advisory field. We also want to briefly highlight how this work changed metadata and digital infrastructure. The previous screenshots showed the really transformative work on the public-facing record, but there's also work happening behind the scenes to decide where in the metadata the labels should be added. So first on the top is a screenshot of the MARC record of an item with a TK label. You can see the library decided to add these to the 540 field, which is the field for information affecting usage. Below this is the JSON record of an item without TK labels, but you'll see there's a field for where TK labels could be added. So this was a new field that was added across the Library of Congress. So because of this really impactful work, any nation or tribe has the ability to add their labels. Pass over to Emily for one more example.
Great, thank you. So much like the Library of Congress example, This example of labels in use is in the context of an institution, in this case, the Newberry Library, stewarding materials from an Indigenous community. And in this case, it's the Pueblo of Santa Ana. So these screenshots show an entry in the Newberry Library's catalog on a publication by an anthropologist about ceremonial vocabulary. The Santa Ana Pueblo assigned the TK Secret Sacred label to indicate that this material is not usually shared publicly. And this is an Ex Libris Alma catalog. So the library created a new field in the catalog to add and support the use of TK labels into the future.
So I wanted to end with a few suggestions for getting started. These steps are really iterative. They're part of continuous processes that really feed into each other. Some of these are not relevant in all contexts, but we've seen these to be helpful in a number of places. We do recommend starting with the learning, which you're already doing right now, which is really great. So we really recommend checking out in particular our short films if you haven't already, as well as the support pages on our website. We also have working groups and networks that you can join to connect with others around the world or in your local region who are doing this work. We also recommend taking stock of your collections, data, and policies to gain a better understanding of your particular context and what information or things you might need to develop. Next, we would recommend institutional or community preparation. So this includes having conversations with others because this work cannot be done alone. You might need to develop new policies around Indigenous data sovereignty and Indigenous cultural and intellectual property. If you are going to be adding notices or labels to platforms like a database, there will be some technical preparation that's also required. And so we recommend that take place as well. So implementation really centers around our local context hub website, which you might have heard mentioned a couple times today. The hub website is to facilitate the application of labels and notices. So you can join the hub in a researcher institution account to generate and apply notices, or you can join a community account to customize and apply labels. Community accounts can also apply labels to collections or data that's shared by an institution or a researcher. So those notices or labels can then be added into your own systems. In particular for institutions and researchers who will be using the notices, we also recommend the collaboration step to identify potential pilot projects. We know institutional collections and data can be overwhelming. They're usually rather large, maybe amassed over hundreds of years. So rather than taking all of that on, we recommend identifying maybe a single collection or data set to help establish workflows with local contexts. We also recommend institutions and researchers ensure they're establishing ethical, reciprocal relationships, which should be approached with consideration, respect, following community protocols, and the appropriate time that takes.
So we want to say thank you at this point for listening to our fairly brief presentation of local contexts and how you could use notices and labels in your own work. You can see here we have some ways to contact us, and I think we'll also be sending out an email afterward with contact information for us. But we appreciate your time, and we would like to go ahead and open up for questions or comments to see if there's anything we can clarify or help answer for folks.
Thank you to our panelists for a lovely presentation. We have gotten quite a few question and answer questions in that module so far. As a reminder, if you have one, go ahead and put it in there. We're going to answer those mostly in the order that they were submitted, but there are a couple of housekeeping ones that I'd like to touch on first. First, will the slides be made available from this presentation for the attendees?
Yes.
Okay, great. And then we did get requests in the chat, both for the website address for local contexts, and then also specifically for the page that has all the separate labels. I didn't want to presume that I had the right links, so if one of you wouldn't mind putting those in, thank you very much. All right, so then we'll go to our first substantial question, which is, have you been able to collaborate with, or do you see potential for use groups in other parts of the world, for example, the Global South?
Corey, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, absolutely. We definitely do, and we have started to have some instances of collaboration with folks in the Global South. Half our team is based in Aotearoa, New Zealand, but we also have collaborated with folks in Laos. We've seen some interest from a few communities across Africa and South America. So um, we really have seen interest quite internationally for local contexts. We have largely been working in English, which is something we're working towards having additional translations available to try to reach more folks. So that's something that we're definitely cognizant of, as well as like just wanting to have the appropriate outreach strategies for those areas. So it's something we're definitely keeping in mind and continue to see interest despite that.
Alrighty, thank you very much. Our next question. Is there a way to include the notices without the graphic if our digital collections management software will not allow the graphic to display?
I can hop in on this one. So yes, we know that there's certain limitations to certain platforms. We've seen folks when they do have this limitation to just use the text, the title and the description of notices. And we think that's a fine use. Like if you're able to add the icon, that would be great. But if you're not, the text will do. And to, if possible, like link to the local context hub where those notices have been generated.
Alrighty, thank you very much. Our next question. Are these notices mostly used for photographs and physical objects? I'm a public librarian and wondering if it would be appropriate to use a notice on books written about Indigenous peoples written by non-Indigenous authors.
So the answer is yes. We would love to see the notices used in such a manner. We would want to, of course, kind of have a conversation about which of the notices would really be the most appropriate. But absolutely, we've seen a lot of really creative use of our notices, and we encourage that and we appreciate that. I don't know, Corey, if you have any examples, or Emily, if there's any specific examples of that, but yes, that's certainly a good use of labels and notices.
Yeah, we've definitely have seen that particular use of notices. In the Newberry example, for instance, those were materials that were collected by a non-Indigenous anthropologist, very similar kind of circumstance, perhaps, to the collection that you're thinking about. So we've definitely seen similar use and would love to see it there.
Alrighty, thank you very much. Our next question, this is a detailed question from the presentation. It says, thank you for this presentation. Can you please remind me which organization or library it was that was using ALMA and had added the traditional knowledge field?
I think we shared maybe Ex Libris and I forget what other ones we shared today, but we can look and see if there are folks who are using Alma. We've seen a lot of interest from various platforms and users of those platforms in adding local context. So it's possible that someone has done that. I don't remember, Emily or Stephanie, if I'm not remembering something we talked about today.
No, it was in our example with the Newberry Library catalog, we described that they were using the Ex Libris Alma catalog, and that they did include a new field in that catalog to support TK label usage.
Awesome, thank you very much. Our next question, apologies if I missed this at the beginning, but from where are the funding sources for this project and ones with similar aims drawn?
So up to this point, that's a great question. And the answer is a little complicated. Up to this point, local context has been grant funded. Jane Anderson at NYU, Kim Kristen at Washington State University, Maui Hudson at Waikato, have all had grant funding to make local context go. As I started, one of the things I mentioned is that we are now a nonprofit organization since 2022, and we're really in the process of transferring over to a subscription model, and so that institutions and researchers would subscribe to local context, our Indigenous communities will always be able to label things for no charge whatsoever to them. A small fee will be asked from institutions so that we can be sustainable and so that we can keep ourselves going. That's not to say that we won't be grant funded and subscription funded for both for a little bit of time. So hopefully that answers your question. Our current funding is from the Mellon Foundation.
Alrighty, thank you very much. And if there is a follow-up, feel free to add that to the end of the queue, but we'll keep moving along for now. This is a question, it says, I think that I heard you say that notices are not meant to be public and are more curatorial tools, but all the examples that you showed were public facing. Can you clarify?
Absolutely, we can certainly clarify. We have one category of notices called the collections care notices that are meant to be an internal tool. The rest of our notices are meant to be external facing, like you were seeing the examples of. So we have one really specific kind of notice that would be internal only.
Alrighty, our next question. I noticed in the TK protocol labels that there were labels regarding TK men and TK women general, although I didn't see one for third gender or agender notices. Is this part of local context? How would one handle something like this?
Can I jump in to start this one off? So this is something we're very aware of. It's actually something that we're hoping to develop another label around this. Labels are being added as we kind of identify these needs, and this is one that we have seen and we have heard from communities. So it is something that is a work in progress.
Let me just add quickly to that all of our labels really have come out of working with, collaborating with Indigenous communities, and they are the ones that tell us what labels they want. So labels are flexible. Labels are something that if we don't have what a community wants, we'll develop that for them. And so like Corey was saying, that is something that we've been hearing folks are interested in, and so that's something we're working on.
Awesome, thank you very much. So our next question, since notices and labels are not right statements, I understand that it would be inappropriate to put either one in a rights field. Is there a best practice for a field to use either one that already exists in Dublin Core or a more customized approach?
I'll start off by just saying that actually, oftentimes our notices and labels are put in a rights field, but we also have some examples of Corey, help me out, but that we have seen folks create their own field specifically for labels and notices, but we also often see as at least a starting point, having them be put in the rights field.
Yeah, I would just echo that we have seen folks put the labels and notices in the rights field. We think that's appropriate because this is related to Indigenous rights.
Alrighty, thank you very much. Couple more housekeeping pieces. In addition to the slides, we are going to be making the recording of the session available to folks. So don't worry, you'll definitely be seeing that. Thank you to everybody who chimed in to clarify that it was Newberry as well. We also actually got a note from the head of cataloging at Newberry who said she was responsible for technical implementation of TK labels in their instance of Alma and Primo V. And to anyone interested, you're welcome to reach out. I'll go ahead and answer it live, and then you'll be able to see Jessica's email address in the answered questions. So thank you very much. Next question, and if you have more, please feel free to put those in the Q&A. Is it possible to implement these practices in archives if a public-facing digital collections page isn't available?
Yeah, I can start that off. Yes, definitely. We've seen and kind of heard from folks that these could also be an internal facing tool. In particular, like collections care notices are meant to be an internal facing tool. So we think that that could be a possible use. The notices in particular are really meant to be public facing if possible, but we can see the use as well for this kind of internal facing as well. I don't know, Stephanie or Emily, if you have anything to add to that.
Alrighty, well, thank you very much, folks. I think that does it for all of the questions that were in the queue for right now. Oh, nope, we just got another one. I was gonna say, if one comes in while I'm talking, then we'll go ahead and keep going. Do institutions have to be subscribers to use TK notices? Since funding for this would be difficult at my institution, do you have suggestions for how to start implementing, considering this work is so important?
So we are in the process right now. In the moment, if you wanted to create a hub account and start working toward notices, you can certainly do that. And then we understand, right? We understand that with institutions, some institutions don't have a lot of funding, and or it would take time to be able to get that funding. So we would encourage you to go ahead and start the process, and we will work with you on the subscription piece. It's our goal. It's what we're working toward. It's where we're going. And we really want the notices and the labels to be accessible to as many people as possible. So it's one of those things that we really would want to work with you. If you're interested in doing this work, we want to work with you so we could figure out what that might look like.
Alrighty, we did get more, one more question. This is a philosophical question, but do you have any opinion on how applying these labels affects whether or not an item should be considered open access? For instance, when the copyright status would be public domain.
That's a great question. Corey, do you want to start? And then
It is a very good philosophical kind of big picture question. So we've kind of seen, like in the Library of Congress example, how the application of the labels changed how rights were recognized on those particular items. So I think we can see that kind of effect of the labels and notices. There is, of course, this kind of like open data, big data issues also that are very prevalent and of interest right now. And we see the labels in particular, but also the notices as kind of being a signal or a marker in those instances where maybe things might be considered open by traditional copyright, to recognize that there might be other things that you need to consider, other rights or that you might need to consider in regards to those materials. I don't know, Steffi, if you have anything you want to add.
No, that's a really fabulous answer. I think that from a very philosophical standpoint, the Indigenous communities that that information comes from and belongs to should be the ones who get to make that decision. And local context is a tool to connect them with that information. So my answer is it really ought to be up to the Indigenous communities. With the full understanding of the systems within which we work, it doesn't quite work that way. Really, we think of ourselves as a tool to make those connections and then try to help institutions do the right thing with information that comes from an Indigenous community.
Alrighty, thank you very much. We've gotten a couple more that have come in. One is a clarification question. If I'm understanding the earlier answer correctly, the notices and labels can be used for materials about Indigenous people that were created by people external to that community.
Yep, they can be, sure. Especially, the way that I kind of think about that is if it's about a community, the community may very well want to have some say-so about that information. So we would definitely want to connect the community to that, regardless of whether, who the author or who the owner of that information is.
Alrighty, thank you very much. Are there any examples of national institutions implementing labels on their content? My interest is in how the collaboration portion happened, as it's something that we have struggled with since we have national content that involves many Indigenous communities, and it's tough to know where to start.
I can start on that one. So yes, we have. I think the Library of Congress would maybe count as a national institution, but understanding your question here about multiple folks maybe being interested in particular materials, we see the labels as additive. Multiple communities can apply their labels to the same materials. it's not exclusionary in that way. We have, and we always recommend maybe starting with something, a smaller set of materials. So maybe it is something that you can identify as being from one particular Indigenous community. That's a really great place to start, but also having these kind of tensions in mind that do exist in these collections.
Yeah, yes, absolutely. And like I would add as well, that it is oftentimes challenging to collaborate with Indigenous communities, right? So say you put notices on a collection, you're not going to be overwhelmed with all of these communities immediately clamoring to collaborate with you, right? It is going to take a little bit more effort on your part to create those relationships, to build the trust between you and that Indigenous community for them to want to do this work with you. And that's a really, really, really important thing to do. The notices are a way to signal, one way to signal, not the only way, but one way to signal that you're ready to start doing that work with Indigenous communities. And it does take some time. So I would also say that it's a tool to tell communities you're interested in doing this work with them, but also they really, they have a lot going on. They're not necessarily going to be able to have the bandwidth to simply jump in and you're not going to have 10 communities all of a sudden being like, let's do this right now. So I also kind of encourage and push a little bit to say, if you need to do this, you need to create those relationships, but it definitely takes time. So taking these steps is a really good way to start the process as you move forward with working with communities.
Thank you. That feels like a great transition because we have a couple of outreach questions in the queue now. The first one is just asking, is there a directory of sorts for the various communities that we could use to contact them?
I could start that one. Love the enthusiasm. We're really excited that you're kind of thinking about these next steps. We do have a list of the communities that are involved in using the labels on our local context hub website. However, we would suggest aiming to establish those relationships before maybe you're like sending a bunch of collections materials to those folks. So using the contact button that is available and really taking the time to consider what's the appropriate approach. If there's another contact maybe off the hub website that would be appropriate, to kind of consider that as well. And Stephanie and Emily, I don't know if there's anything you'd like to add there.
Alrighty, thank you. And just as a one last reminder, if you have any other questions, this might be your last chance. We're running a little low on time now. So go ahead and get those in. But in the meantime, what does your outreach with Indigenous communities look like? Do you help to connect these communities with the institutions that hold their materials?
Yeah, that's a great question that I'll jump in on to start with. We are not, so we are the outreach team, but we are not going into communities to share about local context unless we are asked to. A lot of Indigenous communities hear about local context from other communities, in other contexts. And so at that point, if we are usually reached out to by the community. We are there to support, share more about local context, as well as make some recommendations for the label customization application process. So I would say for the second question, do you help connect these communities with institutions that hold their materials? We're seeing the local context hub as a way to do that. We are working on some new features, such as a mapping component that will kind of automate that connection, at least alert the respective parties to that connection. So that's something that's a work in progress, but we are seeing the hub as a potential place to make those connections. Stephanie and Emily, anything you'd like to add there?
I think that that's a fabulous answer, Corey. Really, the hub is the way that local context does the connecting piece. And I mean, our outreach team definitely works with communities, and our outreach team, Corey and Emily, are absolutely fabulous. They work with institutions as well. But we really feel like creating the relationship is really up to the institution. We can show you who, you know, which communities are already using the hub and already have labels, and we can provide a little bit of advice for how to make those connections and how to start doing it, but we aren't the broker for those actual connections between institutions and Indigenous communities.
Alrighty, thank you very much. That was the last question in our queue, so I think that that's it for our Q&A portion. I didn't know if our panelists had anything else to say. I have to say thank you again. This was an incredibly informative session, or Jody or Dominic, if you had anything else to say as well.
Michael, I will just add my thanks to yours. Our colleagues at Local Context, your knowledge, your work, and the importance of it is it's just really something. Really appreciate having you here today and hope that you've provided the information and inspiration that many of us were seeking. So thank you again.
We very much appreciate you inviting us to this, letting us chat with you all. Please, you know, if you have questions, if you think you might want to give this a try, if you just are curious about to learn more, contact us. Let us know. We're more than happy to have one-on-one individual conversations with folks. And or if you just want some more examples or some more information, we are happy to provide that too. So please feel like you can reach out to us if what we've talked about today is interesting to you.